My name is Tyler Pearson. I am the curator for the Ashby Hodge Gallery. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth annual Geist-Yancey Lectureship. It is also my honor to introduce this evening's distinguished speaker, Dr. Henry Adams. Dr. Adams is a graduate of Harvard College and earned both his MA and PhD in art history from Yale University, where he was awarded the Francis Blanchard Prize for the best doctoral dissertation in his field. Over his distinguished career, he has written more than 450 publications on American art and authored numerous acclaimed books and exhibition catalogs. His works include Eakins Revealed, which Andrew Wyeth described as without question the most extraordinary biography I have ever read on an artist, and Tom and Jack, the intertwined lives of Thomas R. Benton and Jackson Pollock, praised for its narrative power, psychological insight, and groundbreaking discoveries. In addition to his scholarship, Dr. Adams has held major curatorial and leadership roles at many of the nation's leading art institutions, including the Carnegie Institute Museum of Art, the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, the Cummer Museum of Art and Gardens, and the Cleveland Museum of Art. His many honors reflect the breadth of his impact. He was the first Americanist or museum curator to win the Arthur Kingsley Porter Prize of the College Art Association, received the Distinguished Service Medal from William Jewell College for his contributions to Kansas City and the Midwest, and earned the Northern Ohio Live Visual Arts Award for the best exhibition of the year. In 2010, he co-conscripted the award-winning film, The Beauty of Damage, which won the Kodak Best Ohio Short Film at the Cleveland International Film Festival, and later that year received the Cleveland Arts Prize for Lifetime Achievement. More recently, he was honored with the Art Admiration Award from Art Neo and the Baker Nord Award for the Humanities, recognizing him as the most outstanding humanities scholar at Case Western Reserve University. Professor Adams has also brought art history to a wide public audience. In partnership with filmmaker Ken Burns, he produced a PBS documentary on Thomas R. Benton that was viewed by more than 20 million people worldwide. Few scholars have explored Benton's complexities with such depth and passion. And tonight, we have the rare opportunity to hear those insights firsthand. Tonight's program is titled Hillbilly, Rube, or Renaissance Man, Conflicting Views of Thomas Hart Benton. I just love that title. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Adams.
I'd like to start by thanking Tyler and Joe Geist and everyone who's done a wonderful job of making this an inspiring visit to Central Methodist University. And I have to say that I'm inspired and pleased. I call this a small college. It's actually not so very small if you think of all the people that go into creating it, but this is certainly a time in our educational system where small colleges seem to be endangered, and it's nice to see one that is thriving. And I think it's inspiring both in the way that it has kept up with the way that the world is changing and that knowledge and learning is changing, but also has remained true to local traditions and having a place that has a distinctive local character. And I might say that one of the things about universities, we think of them in terms of training students, but I think that they also play an enormous role for the communities in which they're based. And in fact, that's one of the most important aspects of what they do. I might say that I've changed, or how would I say, moved beyond my title a bit. I started off about writing about Thomas Hart Benton and whether he was a Hillbilly Rube or whether he was a Renaissance man. As I wrote, the subject sort of became transformed to trying to analyze why I think that Thomas Hart Benton was a remarkable figure, so that my new title is Benton and the Living Truth. Unfortunately, when I wrote out my full lecture, it's about twice as long as the time there is to give it here, so I'm going to race through some parts of it rather quickly. Some of it, how would I say, it's a little bit philosophical in parts. It may be hard to completely follow, but I think it will give you a sense of how Thomas Hart Benton is actually an extraordinary philosophical thinker who uses art as a way to explore social and philosophical problems. Anyway, over the last 35 years, there's been a remarkable turnaround in how Thomas Hart Benton is viewed. Back in 1989, when I staged a centennial exhibition of his work at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, it received devastating reviews, which were rather discouraging as a reward for a project I'd been working on for several years. And at that point in my life, I was still tender and sensitive rather than calloused. One critic declared that it was the worst exhibition he had seen in 40 years. Another snidely remarked that things aren't up to date in Kansas City. This is Robert Hughes, writing in Time magazine, who declared that Benton was a dreadful artist most of the time. Flat out lapel-grabbing vulgar, incapable of touching a pictorial sensation without pumping and tarting it up to the point where the eye wants to cry uncle. And at this point, Benton was widely viewed as a right-wing reactionary figure, both in his artistic approach and in his political views. And this view was set in concrete by one of the country's leading art historians in the 1940s, H.W. Jansen, who was the author of what in the 1989 was still the best-selling survey book of the history of art, the standard for classes in art history. Here is an article he wrote in 1948 where he basically insisted that the work of Benton and Grant Wood was essentially fascist in its approach, and writing, for example, regionalism has been nourished by some of the fundamental ills of our society, the same ills that in more virulent form created National Socialism in Germany. So let's fast forward to the present. And Benton, while still controversial in some quarters, has come to be securely recognized as one of the all-time great masters of American art. Surely a turning point came in 2012 when Equitable Life Assurance donated Benton's great mural of 1930 America Today to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And there, due to a very gifted curator, Randall Griffey, it was basically installed in a way that reinstalled the entire mural as the way it was originally intended to be shown in a room. He basically did a show of this mural with drawings that attracted 200,000 people. Interestingly, the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art confessed that he'd never heard of Benton until he went to the exhibition. The mural was then reinstalled in the American galleries, and I think what's interesting is that if you go through the galleries today, which have masterpieces by Picasso and Georgia O'Keeffe, you very seldom see more than one person standing in front of a painting, and most of them don't have anyone standing in front of them. You go into the Benton Gallery, there are generally a dozen people there, all of whom are staying for a long time. And they're an interesting mix because some of them are clearly just sort of ordinary American folks who have wandered into this room and become fascinated by it. Others are clearly people of considerable art historical and knowledge about painting who are discoursing at great length about how Benton was handling different things. And I might say that recently there was an article in the New York Times which singled out 7 things not to miss at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Interestingly, Benton's mural was one of them. So that in a relatively short period, Benton has gone from being a pariah to being a recognized American master. This is obviously weird and fascinating in many ways. I first became involved with, aware of the work of Thomas Hart Benton when I was quite a small child. I think even before I learned to read, I enjoyed thumbing through the pictures in a book by Thomas Craven called The Treasury of Art Masterpieces, which was sort of the first coffee table art book. It went all the way from Giotto to Picasso. And I remember being fascinated by this painting by Thomas Hart Benton, which it seemed to me to fit very nicely with the works of Rembrandt and Giotto and other great masters of the past. I had just learned to wear clothes, so I was a little puzzled why the lady wasn't wearing any clothes. But there was something about the painting that was quite captivating. Later, when I was at Yale in graduate school, I was somewhat surprised to find that figures like Benton and Grant Wood weren't viewed seriously as artists. And I took a survey of American art. They each were passed over literally with one slide and with the explanation that they were bad painters and we weren't going to bother with them. And both artists were portrayed as sort of naive advocates of a sort of mindless, uncritical patriotism, as artistic reactionaries and celebrators of a region, the Midwest, that definitely wasn't worth celebrating. I might say that there was one other twist in my interest in Thomas Hart Benton, which was when I taught for a year at the University of Illinois. One of my colleagues was someone named Stephen Polcari, who was an expert on abstract expressionism, who had written an article about how Jackson Pollock had studied with Thomas Hart Benton and had learned many of his principles of artistic composition from Benton. So if nothing else, I was aware that there was a story of some sort here. Interestingly, I'm not sure why this slide is here. Oh, this is just, Benton was an extraordinarily versatile character in addition to being a painter. He was a writer, he was a musician, he was involved in the conservation movement, he was a very colorful figure. The idea that he was a racist, I arrived in Kansas City thinking that he was anti-Semitic, which, how would I say, is not exactly easy to endorse, but just for example, Edgar Degas was viciously anti-Semitic. No one talks about that terrible anti-Semite, the impressionist Edgar Degas. And anyway, after I arrived, I was surrounded by, I don't know, 1 or 2 dozen Jewish people, all of whom were Benton's best friend, all of whom went drinking out with him every night, who invited him to their family birthday parties. And I was struck that this didn't fit with the popular image. And at the end of his life, Benton's daughter Jessie was part of a kind of musical family commune, and it was still very controversial that there was a person with black skin who was part of this commune. So that rather than being some sort of white supremacist racist, it seemed as though Benton was very much the opposite of that. Interestingly for me, one of the key entryways into Benton's work came through his Missouri mural, and this really gives you a journey back into the world of Mark Twain and the American frontier. And I might say that they don't always play this if you take a tour of the mural, but there's actually a recording of Benton describing the mural that is in the room. And it's a wonderful step back. I mean, for one thing, he has this extraordinary Southwest Missouri accent, which seems to bring you back to the days of Mark Twain and the American frontier. And you also start to realize very quickly that this is a very smart, literate person. And you immediately realize that this is someone with a very rich sense of cultural heritage associated with Mark Twain. Well, where am I going here? I just wanted to say that far from being uncritical and celebratory of America, basically you start off the history of Missouri with a fur trader selling whiskey to the Indians, and you end up with the political boss of Kansas City, Tom Pendergast, sitting in a nightclub with two of the trustees of the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. You become aware that this is not just a kind of bland celebration of America, but something more complicated is going on. I might say that Benton was also a remarkable writer. Yeah, here we have the fur trader, Tom Pendergast. And as you look at the mural, you need to look at it carefully to sort of figure out what's going on in the different scenes, but there are also often rather striking contrasts. Here you have a white and black man building a house. Here you have a slave auction that is going on in the background. This is clearly not a kind of accidental juxtaposition on Benton's part. Here is a black man listening to a political speech. Here's a Civil War battle and a man being hanged from a tree. Benton is clearly interested in bringing out the paradoxes of American life and in some cases the brutality of it. Now let's start with the fact that Benton has often been described as a boring, conventional academic realist, and actually look at one of his paintings of America today. And this is certainly not the world we experience in real life. For one thing, the figure of a stooped coal miner who's clearly the victim of black lung disease is expressively distorted and is out of scale with his background setting. In addition, the space as a whole is curiously twisted. Basically, there's a place between these silver moldings where the space seems to be bent in some strange way, and where you miraculously move from West Virginia to New Jersey in a way that is not exactly like everyday life. This is, you're basically moving from a coal miner to an electric plant that's fueled by coal. Here I'm just showing you a Moebius strip in a Klein bottle, and Benton is clearly doing something similarly weird with the way he's representing space. Here's another painting, Instruments of Power, and this is not exactly the way locomotives are generally bent when they rush forward in speed, and it's also not exactly like the real world to have a train, an airplane, a blimp, an electric motor, an electric dam, all pushed together in this way. Now, to make sense of what Benton is doing in this mural, we need to recognize that early in his career, he was essentially a modernist who was interested in the abstract organization of form, and basically created compositions which create a flowing linear rhythm that runs through the composition, both on the surface and in depth, basically bringing your eye back to your starting point and then encouraging you to pursue this rhythm through other visual pathways. Benton absorbed this interest in rhythm largely through his contact with the group of painters known as the Synchromists, who did both abstract paintings and also figurative paintings, ultimately based on the sinuous rhythms of Michelangelo. Benton drew the figure in a Michelangelo-esque way alongside one of the major synchromists, Stanton MacDonald Wright. Here you can see his drawing and how he's exploring the twisting of form. The synchromists never went beyond a single figure, but Benton became interested in how you could create this sort of winding rhythm that would go through a multi-figural composition. And interestingly, in the 1920s, Benton wrote a series of articles called The Mechanics of Form Organization, which are basically about principles for organizing abstract painting. Why is this not? Here we go. This is obviously basically the principles that Jackson Pollock used later in his career. And it's interesting to put an early abstraction by Benton next to an early abstraction by Jackson Pollock. You can see that they're doing pretty much the same thing. And it obviously seems a little bit bizarre that to say that if Benton uses this compositional method, it's reactionary, but that if Pollock uses exactly the same method, that it suddenly becomes very modern. Now, along with his interest in formal composition, in the late teens and 20s, Benton shifted from an interest in purely formal organization to that of studying real objects. And in his autobiography, Benton singled out two moments in this progression. One was when he was in the Navy in 1918 and was basically assigned to do documentary drawings both of the naval base and of ship camouflage, and basically to record accurately exactly what was in front of his eyes. And he basically found this was a fascinating intellectual pursuit in its own right. The other turning point came when he, in 1924, when his father, who he had been estranged from for more than a decade, became ill from throat cancer, and Benton went back to Missouri to sort of be by his bedside for several weeks while he died. And he wrote about this movingly in his autobiography. He says, "I cannot honestly say what happened to me while I watched my father die, and I listened to the voices of his friends. But I know that when after his death I went back east, I was moved by a great desire to know more of the America which I had glimpsed in the suggestive worlds of his old cronies, who, seeing him at the end of his tether, had tried to jerk him back with reminiscent talk and suggestive anecdote. I was moved by a desire to pick up again the threads of my childhood. To my itch for going places, there was injected a thread of purpose, which, however slight as a far-reaching philosophy, was to make the next 10 years of my life a rich texture of varied experience." Essentially, it's at this point that Benton starts to go on long tours around the United States, making sketches of what he sees. He draws New York, Tennessee shack, a stripper in New York, a rodeo in Saratoga, Wyoming, a paper mill in West Virginia. I think what's interesting about these drawings is that he's interested in recording authentically exactly what's in front of his eyes, as it were, without preconceptions. And I think it's also interesting what is going on now. Something is screwed up here. There we go.
So just keep clicking down.
Yeah. Basically, these are, he's learning to make drawings.
So you click the laser button, click the down. So click this button.
Yeah. Okay, great. He's learning to draw very quickly. These are 5 drawings he did in a single day of the cotton loading of a boat called the Tennessee Belle. I think what's interesting is that in some ways he's drawing in a very expressive way with almost cartoonish exaggerations, but he has an extraordinary sense of the spatial organization of things. And these drawings make an interesting statement in their own right, but I think what's interesting is that Benton clearly conceived them as building blocks for a larger artistic statement. Basically a great mural composition that would portray America as a whole. And Benton first conceived the idea of creating a grand panorama of American history when he was in the Navy documenting the camouflage of ships and was given permission to live ashore. At this landlady's house, he came across a 19th century history of the United States by John Spencer, and it was illustrated with rather sentimental wood engravings after 19th century American paintings of historical events. And basically at this point, Benton came up with the notion of presenting a modern form of history. It's no accident that he came up with this idea basically at the same time that a literary and cultural critic, Van Wyck Brooks, wrote an article called On Creating a Usable Past, where he basically argued that American artists and writers had basically presented a picture of the past that was unusable because it was based on the ideals and attitudes of a former generation. And basically, it's the idea that the goal of the art historian or the artist is to create a usable past. Basically, that's what Benton set out to do. He couldn't find an architect to commission paintings from him, so he created a series of large panels, which he put together into something he called the American Historical Epic, which in theory was going to cover American history from first discovery to the present day. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that he's basically putting in exactly the kind of scenes that sentimental 19th century history painters left out. He's introducing slavery. He's showing Indians being driven off their land. He's basically presenting a kind of people's history, which ends up with this rich man with the young girlfriend who's paying off a bootlegger while there's a robbery taking place where the police have conveniently been paid off and are paying no attention to it. So he's basically presenting a much more critical view of American history and American life. And then after he had finished 17 of a proposed 75 paintings, he received an actual commission from the director of the New School for Social Research in New York, which was just in the process of constructing a new building. Benton agreed to paint the mural for no pay if Johnson would would pay for the materials. And Benton used egg tempera, and his colorful remark was, "I'll paint the mural if you'll pay for the eggs." So Benton's mural of America Today, this is the one that's now in the Metropolitan Museum, but this is really his first early masterpiece. It's a grand panorama of America Today. And the total design contains about 300 figures, along with an astonishing number of objects, including ships, factories, trains, all sorts of objects. This is clearly drawn from life studies. Basically, when Benton started planning this mural, he had a bureau whose drawers were filled with hundreds of sketches he had made traveling around the United States. And his first task was basically to sort them into categories and then to combine them into an overall composition. And here you can see how he's taking drawings of a train and of loggers and has put them together into a combined composition. Here, he's basically clearly thinking of things thematically in terms of work processes. You have someone who is gathering cotton and then the cotton being carried down by cart down to a riverboat where it's being loaded. Sometimes his combinations are somewhat amusing. This is his friend Max Eastman, the editor of The Masses, who is a notorious womanizer, and this is a stripper named Peggy Reynolds. These are two drawings he did quite separately from each other in New York, but then in the final mural he has Max Eastman ogling Peggy Reynolds in the subway. And I think what's interesting about this is that Benton was very insistent that everything in the mural was something he had experienced in real life, but then he's combining it in a way that is creating provocative juxtapositions that are adding a different layer of meaning to his life drawings. Here is a section of the mural that shows a holy roller meeting, but Benton juxtaposes this. Here I'm going to well, I'm missing a slide here. Anyway, here you can see how he's got the first compositional sketch. Yeah, well, anyway, he juxtaposes this with burlesque dancers and with lovers on a park bench, so that Benton is clearly interested in the contrasts of American life. Here's his first compositional sketch. Interestingly, when Benton made his murals, he's interested in creating a rhythm that runs through the composition. His first act after the life sketches is to make a clay model of the design, which he then paints in color, uses as the basis for a color study. Now, I think what's interesting, again, the view that Benton was reactionary. Benton was clearly aware of Cubist design, and in particular, by this time, Cubism was not only something that was known in museums, but something that had entered American popular culture. Benton was friends of a Philadelphia artist named Earl Horder, who had a major collection of paintings by Braque and Picasso. When Horder was involved in the Air advertising firm and actually did a advertisement for Steinway pianos that was called Rhapsody in Blue, which basically used a Cubist composition. So at this point, Cubism was part of the American culture. Horder, in turn, was basing his painting on a painting by Severini, which is now in the Museum of Modern Art. And interestingly, there's a piano player in Benton's America Today mural who presumably is playing Rhapsody in Blue. Now, in creating a usable past, Benton was basically bringing new, essentially Marxist approaches to American history, which he knew about through his friends both at the City and Country School and also from the New School for Social Research, basically the philosopher John Dewey and Carolyn Pratt, who were educational philosophers, and then from historians such as Leo Huberman and Charles Beard. In this period, Benton illustrated a book written by Leo Huberman, which is largely a Marxist history of the United States. Many of the images in the book relate closely to his murals. Huberman posed for some of Benton's paintings. And it's easy to see that the illustrations often relate to scenes that are in his mural of America Today, so that Huberman's book is essentially providing an explanation of the, how would I say, the Marxist view of the different economies of the United States, the different regions of the United States, and then also the oppression of Native Americans, of workers, and of other people. Now, I think what's interesting is that while Benton is often portrayed as anti-intellectual, in fact, his murals present an interesting example of semiotics, which is basically the study of signs and symbols and how they create meaning. It explores the philosophy of meaning. It grows largely out of a philosophy known as pragmatism, which is based on the idea that, well, let me, basically, the idea of pragmatism is that to understand a concept, one must consider what differences it would make to practical reality or to practical action if it were true. And this principle sounds simple. It's more complicated than one would think. There's an essay by William James where he discusses why we think there are tigers in India. Most of us have never been to India. If we went to India, we probably didn't see tigers there. So what is the chain of inferences that led us to this conclusion that there are tigers in India? And it turns out that we basically manipulate reality through symbols. And Charles Sanders Peirce identified three forms of a signifier: the icon, the index, and the symbol. Basically, the icon is something which bears a direct relationship to reality. An index directly correlates to what it represents, but it's not a direct representation. And a symbol is a sign where the relationship is arbitrary rather than direct. Essentially, if you use the system of categorization, I think what's interesting is that Benton's murals are essentially an investigation of how we know what we know and whether it's true. Basically, his travel drawings were a very direct representation of exactly what he was seeing. When he put it into his mural, he's basically presenting it at a different level of generation of interpretation, where an actual person is becoming a symbol for, let's say, farmers in the South. And he's creating new meanings basically through juxtaposition with other scenes. Just for example, you have the white farmer who's standing in front of the chain gang of black prisoners being guarded by a white guard, and he's also presented in direct contrast with a black cotton picker, so that essentially Benton is taking the initial direct representation and adding different levels of meaning to the way he juxtaposes it with other things. I think what's interesting about Benton's murals is you need to look at them closely. Here, for example, is a Midwestern farmer who's about to step on a rattlesnake. There are often sort of ominous things that take a while to notice. Here are rugged city builders in New York City. You need to look quite closely to realize that in the distance are these black clothed people who are clearly racketeers who are involved in sort of shady dealings with the labor movement. Oh, and I think here may be what I want. Here we have God is Love contrasted with a burlesque show, contrasted with lovers on a park bench. Basically, this scene takes on different meanings according to what it's juxtaposed with, and rather than giving you a single choice, Benton has this very elaborate set of visual pathways so that it's as if his meaning is never completely settled. It's always a meaning that can move in different directions, and in some regards is unresolved. And Benton, people have made fun of him for this, but he actually said that the meaning of the painting was not up to him. It was basically up to the spectators of his paintings to interpret it. Now, the Missouri mural essentially goes one step further than his mural of America Today because he separates knowledge into different sorts. Basically, you have a strip here that is telling the story of Missouri history, but then he has scenes of Missouri mythology, which are basically the point at which real events become something more artistic and symbolic. Basically, Benton was creating a parody of the Farnese ceiling by Annibale Carracci. He's interested in the idea that what would happen if we take these heroic poses of the Carracci painting and put real-life people in these scenes. His choice of Missouri mythology is rather irreverent. This is the most positive of them, of Huckleberry Finn and Jim on their raft, but his other two scenes are basically Jesse James robbing a train and a bank. I might say that there are often other layers of meaning. It turns out that the person who posed for Jesse James was a nephew of Jesse James, who was a script writer for Charlie Chaplin. Here are Frankie and Johnny having their shootout in a St. Louis saloon. And he also works his personal autobiography into the painting. Basically, this is his brother Nat, who was a prosecuting attorney who is presenting, basically presenting his prosecution before a sleeping judge. Here is his father giving a political speech. And there are often, I guess I don't have, oh yeah, well, here basically, again, you have interesting juxtapositions. For example, there's the African-American man leaning against a post. You look into the background, you see a Civil War scene and a lynching taking place, so that Benton is clearly interested in bringing out the contrasts of American history in a provocative way. I think what's interesting is that Benton has been widely described as sort of reactionary and anti-intellectual, but in fact, if you look at his murals, they're quite a sophisticated analytical examination, both of the principles of composition and of basically what it means to turn a visual image into meaning. And he's exploring the idea that visual meaning can be of different types depending on the visual pathways we choose to pursue. Now, basically, when I did my Benton exhibition, art criticism was dominated by the theories of Clement Greenberg, which were also basically carried out in the Museum of Modern Art, and the idea was that art was moving towards ever greater abstraction and also towards basically reducing any element of narrative or storytelling to reduce art to the pure means of expression that is to the use of paint and also to something that was as flat as possible, so that basically ultimately what you end up with is something similar to an Ed Reinhardt painting where you paint a painting that's completely black. You've gotten rid of all that narrative stuff that supposedly is not artistic, but in the process of eliminating storytelling, you've essentially annihilated meaning. I think what's interesting is that at some point, probably starting in the 1980s, you had renegade contemporary artists who became, basically discovered that purely abstract painting is not the best way to communicate issues of race or gender or social issues, and who basically turned back to sort of traditional storytelling and imagery, but in an unconventional way. And I think what's interesting is that at this point in time, Thomas Hart Benton, rather than seeming an anachronistic figure, is seeming to be much more contemporary than the kind of abstract painters who were celebrated in the 1960s. So that's sort of a fast moving presentation of my thoughts about Benton. I don't know if anyone has any questions.
If we could give a quick round of applause. We do have some time for a Q&A, so if you have a question, please raise your hand, and I will come running up to you as fast as my little legs will carry me.
Were the other regionalists so ill-received in that same time period, like Grant Wood or some of the other regional artists?
The regionalists basically became very under attack in right after World War II. And that was the period where European modernism was associated with social progress. And it becomes a little complicated because they were criticized in different ways. Basically, Grant Wood was well accepted in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, but when he moved to Iowa City and took a job at the University of Iowa, he came into extreme conflict with the members of the art history department. Grant Wood, there are lots of issues about Grant Wood that have not been very openly discussed, but at the end of his life, he was very despairing, was a major alcoholic, and ended up dying of liver cancer in the early 1940s. John Stewart Curry also died early of high blood pressure, and at the end of his life told Benton that he felt that he'd made a mistake by becoming a regionalist. Benton was made of tougher material and was very much abused in the 1940s and 50s, but just kind of kept on going. And by the end of his life was experiencing a bit of a revival. And there's a wonderful statement he said, old age is a wonderful thing, you outlive your enemies. But there was definitely a period where regionalist art went into eclipse. I guess I'd say that there are many paradoxes to this. Benton in some quarters was always admired, and if you look at the prices for Benton lithographs, they started off being sold in the early 1940s for $5 a piece. They now sell for about 1,000 times that, And if you look at the price curve, it doesn't curve, it's just a straight upward sloping line that has continued pretty much without fluctuation through all the strange ups and downs of the art world and, the periods when Benton was liked and when he wasn't liked. So it seems as though there's some kind of enduring quality to Benton's work as there is to that, particularly of Grant Wood. I think Curry is a little bit a more problematic figure. And I might say that when I read the article by Jansen, which was when I was first teaching a course on American art, I thought this is a great article to assign to my students, but I thought it was funny. It was so over the top in its hostility, and I've thought a little bit about that. Jansen was supposedly an art historian, but here's this article where he's explaining how bad Benton and Grant Wood are as painters. He never talks about their paintings. He just launches these social accusations against them. And there are many issues to that. I mean, it's interesting that, my show was greeted with the word that everything's not up to date in Kansas City. I think there's still the notion that, the Midwest is the great American desert, and that if you want to have art, you've got to go to New York. And I might say that's part of the perennial fascination of Benton's work to me. It seems to me that if you think about figures who have been controversial in modern art, the classic thing is something like French Impressionism, where it goes from being controversial to the fact that people accept it and they love it. What's interesting about Benton is that he's still, more than 50 years after he did these paintings, he's still a lively source of controversy. There's a wonderful statement by a guy named Peter Lewis where he said that great art starts fights in bars, and Benton is still an artist who starts fights in bars. And I guess I'd say that one of the things I find interesting about his work, it looks like he's doing things that are simple, but both people who like Benton's work and people who dislike it immediately feel they need to stand up and say what they think art is and what the meaning of art is, and they generally say completely ridiculous things. And there's something about Benton's work that makes everyone want to stand up and make a speech.
Thank you.
So what were the major shifts that happened, do you think, between, was it just a shift in art history criticism from 1989 to 2012, or was it just historical shifts?
I think there's a bit of luck in this, but the fact is that I think to a surprising degree, the people who were critical of Benton's work weren't actually looking at it. And the decisive change was really due to Randall Griffey. When the America Today mural entered the Metropolitan Museum, that's a great badge of approval, and also proved tremendously popular in a way that they hadn't anticipated. And I think that, I think that there's also been a shift in critical statements about art. We're no longer, color field painting has become boring, and young painters are not interested in pouring paint on canvas in the way that they were a few decades ago. There's been a pretty dramatic shift there, and suddenly the old criticism of Benton that he's not producing pure abstraction, he's producing stories, doesn't seem to connect very well with what we value in contemporary art today. And I do think that with issues of taste, there are often rather sudden turning points. That partly has to do with technology as a whole. I think there's also a generational thing that after 50 years, you tend to have sudden shifts in evaluation. And I guess I'd say that I think Benton is interesting because you have the artistic issues, but you also have the New York Midwest issue. You have the issue, I guess I'd say one of the things, I mean, I certainly, when I started working on Benton, thought of him as a bit of a hillbilly, though certainly a colorful figure. I think the irony is that Benton, in many ways, was the most cultured painter in the history of American art. You know, what other painter was a major painter, but a major writer, a major figure in American music, a major figure in the environmental movement, a major figure in civil rights, who had this very colorful set of friends. And I guess I'd say that one of my attractions to Benton, who certainly could be a pain in the neck at times, but this is someone I would love to sit down and have a conversation with. Yeah.
It's hard to think of another artist who is more pivotally an example of Americana.
Yeah.
I mean, he really does cover the breadth. And in terms of Americanism, I can't think of anybody that would be placed ahead of him.
And I might say that one thing about Benton is that he's a little bit a double-sided figure. And as a child, he spent his summers in Neosho, Missouri, where he sort of hung out, you know, with his rural friends. And then during the winter, he's in Washington, D.C., and he's going to the Library of Congress, and he's associated with very well-educated people. And I think that Benton could shift from one mode to another. In a sense, these were both authentic aspects of his personality. And I think that he also took, basically in modern art, fairly early with figures like Whistler, it became popular to do something that stirs up tremendous controversy. You get a number of negative reviews, and then everyone rushes to see your show, and some people decide they actually like it and they buy your paintings, and you become a success. And Benton turned this modernist technique against modern art in an interesting way.
We should have time for one final question. No takers? No? Okay.
Well, I should make just one final speech, and then I'll knock off. But anyway, it's very inspiring to come see the Ashby Hodge Gallery. I think that's a gallery that seems quite impressive right now. I think it's going to seem even more impressive 20 or 30 years from now as the reputation of Benton and his pupils rises. Number of wonderful things, but I think it's nice also that the holdings of the gallery relate so closely to this region and to something that's very particular to this region. And it's also nice that the art is being so generously shown around the campus. I think that even students who seem unresponsive to the art, who probably couldn't tell you the difference between one painting and another, are sort of absorbing information through a kind of osmosis, and that this is transforming who they are in exactly the way that art should. So anyway, it's been very inspiring to come here.
A huge thank you to everyone.
Thank you for coming out. Thank you to Dr. Geist for the opportunity to bring in these wonderful speakers. And thank you, of course, to Central for this space as well. If we could give Dr. Adams one final big thank you.